There are two questions you can ask about any biblical passage, questions which often get confused, but which are in fact quite separate. The first is this passage inspired by God? And the second, is it literally true? And the two questions can be asked differently about different passages throughout the whole Bible, which, after all, as people often say, is a collection of books written by different authors at different times in history, rather than one single book representing one single voice of one single person. The whole thing may be seen as having been written under the inspiration of God, but that doesn't alter the variety of styles, the variety of genres, and the variety of human authors. For example, you could look at the story of the talking snake and God walking in the Garden of Eden in the cool of the day and ask yourself, is it literally true? And many Christians and Jews would say, not as such, but is it inspired by God? Does it come from God? Does it contain authoritative messages from God? And to that question, they would undoubtedly say yes. The story of Jonah, in the book of Jonah, who's swallowed by the whale or large fish, is a similar case in point. But when we come to the New Testament, and particularly the Gospels, where we have quite striking stories written within living memory of the events they purport to describe, this sort of approach breaks down. We can't evade the fundamental question with regard to at least some of, if not all of the miracles of Jesus. Did they really happen? And when we look at the story of the raising of Lazarus in John's Gospel, this is such an extraordinary miracle that this question strikes us with particular force. And yet it is too often evaded. Because anything written by John is so full of symbolism and meaning, pointing both backwards and forwards and tantalizing the mind, you can read commentaries on this passage which follow all the symbolism and take us to very deep levels of wisdom, but don't actually address the question that an unbiased or unprejudiced observer who comes across the passage for the first time must always be asking themselves, is this describing something that really happened? Did Jesus really raise Lazarus from the dead when he'd been in the grave several days, and, as was graphically said by his sister, had clearly started to decompose? How can you evade this question? Well, I suppose you could say that the story is entirely made up. But if you take that approach, are you saying that the writers were trying to deceive the readers, or that there was some sort of audience who would originally have heard this story and thought to themselves, well, it's not describing a real event, but it's full of deep meaning, and then somehow this understanding of the story was forgotten and people started taking it literally for years and years? Or alternatively, you could just say that those were credulous and superstitious times and they believed in a lot of things which we wouldn't believe in today, and they had clearly misunderstood some entirely natural event. There was no deception involved. Nobody was trying to tell a metaphorical story. They were just primitive and simple people, and we can reject their beliefs. But I think for Christians to take either approach does lead to insuperable difficulties. And when I ask myself, do I think this could have happened? I have to say I find it very difficult to imagine. I do find it extremely difficult to believe in the historicity of the story of the raising of Lazarus. And yet, it is very important to me to open my mind to the possibility that what I find it hard to imagine might yet have happened. I'm not prepared to close off avenues of possibility like that. And if sense can be made of this story, as I believe it can very much, then maybe I should keep my mind open to the possibility that it describes something that really did happen, something that Jesus really did. And once I've opened my mind to this possibility and started to reflect on what it might all mean, all sorts of levels of wisdom and meaning in this story come to the surface and can be reflected upon. The story can be contrasted in two ways. Firstly, with other stories of apparent resurrection, not found in John's Gospel but in the others, the story of the raising of Jairus' daughter and of the widow's son of Nain in Luke's Gospel, and also with Jesus' own resurrection, a contrast of a very different kind. And I suppose if you look at the Gospels as a whole, there is a progression from the one to the other. If we look at those earlier healings, the story of Jairus' daughter and the widow's son of Nain, these people were quite possibly in some sort of grey area, some sort of hinterland between life and death. And I don't think it would make a great deal of difference to our acceptance of these miraculous resurrections if we believed that the victims whom Jesus raised had in fact been suffering some sort of very deep coma, rather than having actually passed over the insuperable boundary between life and death, which Lazarus clearly has in the story in John's Gospel. After all, we know a lot more these days about this grey area between life and death, the hinterland where people can shut down for quite significant periods of time, or can be artificially shut down for the purposes of very serious operations, and can, under certain circumstances, be brought back or come back. Because in those two stories, the story of Jairus' daughter and the widow's son of Nain, Jesus is healing people. He is bringing them back to be with their families. Yes, he is quite possibly showing a power over death, but the main point is one of healing. The story of Lazarus is very different. This is a case where Jesus comes up against death in its full reality. Lazarus has been in the tomb for 3 days. He will have started to decompose. This is real death. And I think the way Jesus responds to it, as he responds to his own death, tells us something very important about God's plan for the world. Death is not something to which we should accommodate ourselves. Death is not something we should accept. I don't think Jesus would want us any more than Dylan Thomas to go gentle into that good night. He rails against his own death. He weeps at the death of Lazarus. And what is seen in the story of the raising of Lazarus, it seems to me, is Jesus meeting death and beating it, defeating it, showing that God regards death as not part of his final plan, but as something to be overcome. And the extraordinarily striking effect of this among the people around Jesus when he has brought Lazarus back from the dead is extremely striking in John's Gospel. John tells us that many of the local people in Judea living in that area began to believe in Jesus, to follow him as a result of what they had seen. But alternatively, there was another response possible. The chief priests, those who began to plot against Jesus, began their plotting at this point, overwhelmed with terror and hatred of what Jesus had done. Whether because they saw this as a particularly blasphemous conjuring trick, a claim to have power over death itself, or whether they had a sneaking suspicion that here was a power that they couldn't deal with, a power that really had come up against death and won, is unclear. But the dual response, the alternative responses of accepting Jesus in joy and wonder at what he had done, or turning from him in terror and hatred, indicate the importance of this story in John's Gospel. There is no time here to explore possibilities as to why it is made so much of in John's Gospel and simply doesn't appear in the others. I think here I would refer to the work of Richard Bauckham, who produces some, to my mind, extremely plausible reasons as to why John talks of this incident and the other Gospel writers don't. But the story of the raising of Lazarus is open-ended. It doesn't end there. It looks forward to the yet more wonderful and glorious resurrection of Jesus himself, where he himself went through the barrier of death and returned, not as Lazarus to live presumably his ordinary previous earthly life, but breaking through to something yet more wonderful and glorious. But the story of that will have to wait for another week.